We're so excited that you're here with us today. We have a fantastic lineup of speakers to talk about the next generation of thermal infrastructure. This is a topic that we've been exploring with our friends that are a part of the Renewable Heat Now Coalition. Renewable Heat Now is an initiative that we launched about 4 years ago, and a big mission of Renewable Heat Now has been to make renewable heating and cooling affordable and accessible to all New Yorkers. And we've had some really incredible wins. When we started, there weren't any rebates for geothermal, and now we are leading the country. New York is set to spend $3.5 billion over the next 5 years to advance heat pump adoption, which is incredibly exciting. And Renewable Heat Now is continuing to push on the cutting edge to make sure that we really get to scale with these technologies, going house by house, doing heat pumps, and with just the homeowner or building owner as the only owner of the heat pumps is not necessarily going to get us there. So we need to go big, which is why we invited these speakers today to share with you thermal infrastructure, third-party ownership. We're going to get into district heat a little bit, and hopefully we're all going to learn a lot today. So we really appreciate you joining. Hope that your summer is going well and that you're staying cool and staying healthy. And once again, please ask questions. You can put them in the Q&A, and stay tuned for the end, where we're also going to talk a little bit about next steps, one of which is to join the Renewable Heat Now campaign, because we need to keep building this movement and pushing the envelope so that, well, our building envelopes are as tight as possible and that they're heated and cooled with renewable technologies. So I will pass it off to my colleague, Michaela Shavako, to introduce our speakers. Nick?
Thanks, Betta. And I also just wanted to mention that if you wanted more of a heat pump 101, because we'll only briefly touch on that during the presentations, you can go to our YouTube channel where we go more in depth on the technology itself. It's called Renewable Heat Online Teach-In from March 2019, and I'll also link it in the chat and follow up. But one of our speakers, our first one, Cullen Kasunic, from the head of finance from BlocPower in New York City, will be giving a brief heat pump 101, very brief, and also talk about financing and adoption of heat pump technology. And then we have Audrey Schulman and Zeyneb Magavi, co-executive directors of HEET, Home Energy Efficiency Team in Massachusetts, talking about getting off gas in Boston, the role of utilities and working with them. And they may touch on the gas planning proceedings in New York and Massachusetts, but they may not. And then Stuart Yanow from Geotility, he's the president of Geotility and Orca Energy Corporation in British Columbia, Canada, to give us some example projects and ownership models of shared geo loop systems and the criteria needed for a successful district geothermal system. And finally, last but not least, we have Owen Brady, the Future of Heat Manager at National Grid, to talk about how National Grid is orienting towards heat pump adoption and how that's evolved from their Riverhead pilot project in Long Island to the recent Niagara Mohawk Future of Heat panel that was submitted earlier this month, or last month. So without further ado, I'll pass it off to Cullen to kick us off. Cullen, if you want to share your screen.
Yep, good afternoon. Great to be here. Thanks everyone for joining as well. Let me know if you can see my screen okay.
Yes.
Great. So yeah, my name's Cullen. I'm with BlocPower. We're a technology-enabled energy efficiency developer making America's small and mid-sized buildings greener, healthier, and smarter. So we do this through software that targets the best customers for energy efficiency retrofits, through systems that develop accurate scopes of work remotely, and through this custom-built no money down financing program. So So we all know our buildings are old and creaky here in the US. And sorry, I think my mouse is advancing quicker than, okay. We all know our buildings are old and creaky here in the US. Many were built between the 1950s and 1970s. In fact, in our area, a lot of them were built before World War II. So small and medium buildings, right? There's over 5 million of them that are smaller than skyscrapers, but bigger than single family homes. They have a particular impact. Owners spend a lot of their operating budget and waste a lot of money on energy, right? This is disproportionate to these small and medium-sized buildings, right? They're really impacted in this regard. They're full of health hazards, right? Both COVID and lead, asbestos, asthma. And again, disproportionate amount of greenhouse gas emissions are coming from these buildings, and they're really hard to target, right? They're not being helped because they're tough to serve. They have all these development challenges of a large building, right? Design, permitting, financing, but they don't have the same large building revenues, large building infrastructure, or staff. So we put a series of systems together that can help in the process, right? From analysis to project management through financing and ownership. And we work a lot with multifamily buildings, including a lot of affordable housing. So our software was initially designed for multifamily buildings. We're active in driving energy efficiency workforce development here in New York. And we've built partnerships with organizations on the affordable and the market rate side. And I think most importantly, in the context of this financing here, we've worked really hard to make sure that our financial underwriting and structures are inclusive of sort of all building types and all areas, so that it can be broadly used and approved. But now, what did we find when going through this? We found that many of these buildings, right, they can really benefit from air source heat pumps. These systems can cut energy costs, they can cut OpEx, they can even cut OpEx against gas, they can even be cheaper there in the right situations now. And we'll talk a little later about where we think the industry and pricing is going and how all of this can drive costs down. But they can increase building value, increase the tenant comfort and happiness. And so, but back up, right? What is an air source heat pump, right? This is what we're talking about, putting air source heat pumps in. And I know it's been discussed, right, on some other presentations here, but they're fundamental technology that can seem new, but really it's just a highly efficient air conditioner that can run both ways, right, to generate heating and cooling. It works well in New York State. It works well even down to -17 degrees Fahrenheit when you get the right systems. And it's fully electric, which means it's as green as the grid. And we know the grid is getting greener all the time, right? Especially with all the policy drives and goals that are there. So in fact, we discovered 20 benefits for the various stakeholders, right? Building owners have their savings, but tenants, they get the increased control, they get comfort. Sometimes they have cooling that they never had, and the indoor air improvement qualities. For utilities, there's fewer gas pipeline constraints, and it can balance out things on winter loads, winter peak loads. And then for everybody, right, the reduction in pollution, the reduction in asthma rates locally, and then going against climate change. So there's broad applicability across the US, especially where folks need both heating and cooling, which is really a lot of the northern and central United States, right? And in fact, the global opportunity is huge too for similar reasons. And there's been a lot of adoption in Western Europe and Japan already. But the barriers to adoption are real, right? There's a mental cost of switching to anything new, especially when one may not be familiar with it. And you probably don't know if you're going down this road in the decision process, what questions to even ask, right? And then there's that sticky element of cost, right? So what did we do? Sort of as a lesson to share, we did the same thing that worked to bring solar across the country. We put a no money down offering for heat pumps together. It's widely accepted the availability of financing and panel cost reductions together form this sort of self-reinforcing cycle that drove down costs, increased adoption, which in turn drove down costs further. And even as recently as 2017, when we just had some data we were able to gather, third-party ownership was still growing, right? It's a popular thing. So what do? We buy these systems, we install them, we own them, we operate them, and we let customers pay as they save, all of which address these challenges and these major barriers to adoption head on. So perceived risk gets addressed because the system is managed and maintained by us, right? This also helps with the complexity since we're taking on a lot of this. We know the tech, we know the main structures, we know how to work things since we do this professionally. Because it's no money down, the upfront cost is not a barrier too. And since folks are paying as they save, ongoing cost concerns get addressed also. So with that too, the immediate savings can help push through some customer inertia. And because of the building size, we can't share savings like larger buildings might do on some energy efficiency contracts. It just sort of doesn't work in terms of auditing things. It still seems to be okay, right? And we're able to, with our software and systems, guarantee that the systems will work and provide good savings estimates. But now, what are some of the disadvantages here? Well, as you may know with solar, if you own it yourself, if you have the money to put up, you can save more, right? Because there are risks here that the customer is not taking, and we need to take them, and our financial backers do too. That means if you compare this to a normal loan, where you might be taking it out against building equity. We work with commercial clients, not homeowners, right? Working with these small and medium-sized buildings. The costs will still be, the financing cost, the cost of capital could be lower if you're doing it yourself, right? But having more savings than payments speaks to this, though not always fully when talking with folks. Also, we are including maintenance and this guarantee that the system will work for the full 15-year lease term, which is a significant value, but it's kind of hard to quantify that, right? And we are on the hook for that. We need to make sure that works. So that's challenging. We need to get our financial folks comfortable too. And the customers are still taking some risks, right? They're signing a 15-year contract, and that's a barrier that needs to be addressed. Nonetheless, we've taken a complicated ownership model. We've taken a complicated ownership model and brought it down to a simple situation where we have a subsidiary to own the assets. We sign a service agreement, that's the lease, with the customer. And with some debt from an outside provider, we contract for construction and maintenance with one company, generally just one company. They do the maintenance for the full term, right? We maintain the customer relationship. The structure simplicity we found is very important for keeping costs low, even more important than us sort of trying to chase low cost capital from capital providers. So from the advent of financing 10 years ago to now, solar has dropped in price by more than a factor of 4, right? From over $8 a watt down to $2 a watt. And you can see capacity has been growing since. This slide is a couple years out of date, but the trend has only been similarly more exponential. We're looking at a more modest price drop, 50% over the next 10 years. Others may have more data, but this gets to the point where we're putting in a heat pump is cheaper than simply replacing one's natural gas system. Right now, heat pumps are costly, but they are number 2 in LCOE, which is another reason why financing is good. Bringing costs down will bring them into the lead for both. And we think this comes from cost reductions, but largely from decreases in installation, soft cost, and as the process gets more streamlined, all things that come from scale. So to wind it up, there's some significant policy support from the state on a lot of fronts, which I think there's discussion going on. I mean, we've got Flex Tech, which helps with design. The multifamily performance program provides support for affordable housing. And then this new large New York State clean heating program provides direct support for the heat pump installation from New York to Buffalo, everywhere in between. So again, a little bit of an outdated slide, but we agree the market's growing and will grow more. And so we see a very bright future for heat pumps here in New York, driven by financing and driven by scale.
Awesome, thank you, Cullen. And just to keep things moving along, I'll pass it off to Audrey, Schulman, and Zeyneb Magavi with HEET about getting off gas in Boston.
We can't share this screen, or at least I'm trying to, and it's not letting me yet.
Okie doke, 1 second. Oh, you should be able to. I think you are a co-host.
Okay. All right. Ah, there we go. Sorry.
Okay, good.
Good. So I'm Audrey Schulman, and I'm mildly competent on Zoom. Hopefully you're seeing the presentation.
Yeah.
So we're from HEET, and HEET, there we go. Our system, you know, we cut carbon emissions now by driving systems change. We're a nonprofit in Massachusetts. We don't take money from gas or geothermal industries. We think of the gas infrastructure as a large tree with its branches spread out across the state. And if you think of it that way and you want to bring down a large tree in a crowded area, you don't saw through the trunk, but instead you bring it down in sections. We want to prune that gas tree back over time strategically. And so one method to do that pruning is through solar and heat pumps. It's a fabulous option, but it doesn't work on every building. It's least efficient when you need it the most, when the air temperature is most extreme, thus straining the electric grid. And low income and people with financing generally can't get this, although Cullen's option is an incredible one that I hadn't heard of. And it does require the collapse of the gas industry, so they will fight it tooth and nail. So the question is there potentially a faster way? One option that we'd like to suggest is the geomicrodistrict. Its speed comes through its growth model, which I'll explain. It's a networked geothermal system along a single street segment. There's a shared loop of ambient temperature water driving thermal energy up and down the street, with service lines delivering the temperature to each building along the way. Inside each building would be a heat pump pulling the temperature off it needs, that temperature being between, approximately 40 to 90 degrees, is way closer to the temperature we need in our buildings, so it's more efficient. And there's a linear array of shallow boreholes, 500 feet or less, in the right-of-way of the street. And our, one option is to have this owned, installed, and maintained by the gas companies. So network geothermal is different from single building installations of geothermal in the same way that the internet's different than a standalone computer. There's synergistic benefits. The first benefit comes from that shared loop of water. It can move the wasted energy around to be reused. So imagine a supermarket or any of these big buildings you see here with their fridges or AC running, or an ice rink. They're gonna all be rejecting heat into that shared loop of water, which can then be used by the homes down the street. Colorado Mesa University has a system like this, and 40% of the year, this method alone delivers all the energy needed in those buildings without accessing the boreholes. To add to that savings, we add borehole thermal energy storage. This way the system can be designed to allow thermal energy to be dumped into the borehole array during the summer, for instance, and then pulled back out during the winter when you need it. We did a feasibility study in Massachusetts with Riverhead Engineering. In the comparison you see here, they used the same depth of boreholes, same spacing down the street to see how much each street segment, the system could meet the energy demand of each street segment. They calculated hourly energy loads, checked against real customer data. And as you can see, the low density and medium density mixed use street segments met 100% of the cooling and heating demand. That's great, but there's one potential problem, that they both produce excess energy. In the low density residentials one, it's extra cooling, and in the medium density, it's extra heating. This would be a weakness over time because it would gradually heat up that water until it's no longer as efficient, makes it harder for the heat pumps to do their work. But if instead you interconnect each of the street segments, you can export that excess heat to other street segments. So let's say we pilot on this street, we have any extra energy, we ship it out to the next street segments we interconnect, because they can interconnect like Lego blocks, until we have a whole district energy system moving excess heat around as needed, increasing efficiency and resilience. And now Zeyneb takes over.
Okay. Delighted to be here, and I will be quick. I'm the other co-executive director, and I get to pick up where we left off, that this process of thermal management that would be taken on by the thermal management utility has so many exciting options. Not only can you include all kinds of sources and sinks, which you bring onto or off of the system as needed, but also you can play a little bit. If you can't find enough sources and sinks to balance, for example, Gray Edge Group has pioneered some of them. One of their systems in Colorado Mesa is shedding excess heat in the irrigation water during the shoulder months, which keeps the lawns greener for longer. And other fun things you can do are melt snow on sidewalks, cool outdoor air. And because you can manage annually, you can shed your excess annual heating or cooling, you know, in an alternate season to where it might be needed. So next slide. So what we'd started out trying to, the goals we had were to make a safer system, to cut greenhouse gas, and then there were some other benefits that emerged from this process that we hadn't set out to get. So if with a certain land use and low density, a geogrid, regardless of who owns it, is certainly safer. It doesn't explode. That's rather nice. Bureau Happold estimated greenhouse gas savings on the Massachusetts grid emissions targets currently to be 60% savings with installation today and 90% by 2050. Of course, if we thoroughly green our electric grid, we get to zero. What else? Resilient, reliable, one section goes down, another covers. It provides cooling, and we're going to need more. And that cooling, it helps cut peaks on the electric grid. So this chart you can see here is again from that Gray Edge Group Colorado Mesa case study. I find it pretty stunning. This geomicrodistrict install grew from serving 800,000 square feet to 1,200,000 square feet in this chart, and yet the electric demand stayed remarkably flat. As the thermal system got more efficient as it grew, and this is a wonderful concept, remaining in a passive house-like balance for longer, reducing heat pump use and cutting cooling tower use. Their gas backup in that case study hasn't fired in 11 years. So the college who owns it are thrilled. Next. So one of the core questions we get asked a lot, because here we are a climate change nonprofit, advocating that utilities should potentially build the geogrid. And why are we doing that? Should utilities own the geogrid? Next slide. So when we started this work, we were actually attempting to cut methane emissions from our aging, leaking gas system. But as we understood our gas system better, we saw that all our methane leak legislation and reduction work was triage and not a solution, and that our state's solution was to replace those leaky pipes. And that might sound logical, but this is a map here of just the next 5 years of pipe replacement sites in the Boston area. And with some quick numbers, you realize that this is a serious risk. So 43% of our Boston gas territory, over 40%, is leak prone and in need of replacement. We're a few years into a 20-year plan. Pipe is amortized over 40 years, which is 10 years after our 2050 carbon goal mandates. Our carbon-free Boston plan suggests we cut natural gas by 80% in order to get there. And so who pays for those pipes? Are we digging stranded assets in the ground? A recent economics brief just claimed the total cost of GSEP could be as high as $17 billion. I know that New York is also putting a lot of money into new gas pipe. And this gas pipe replacement plan takes us in the opposite direction of our climate plans at great financial risk. People in the industry know this, as in New York, but it's challenging because we have immediate safety risks. And so how do we balance risks? The many billion-dollar question is, should we instead prioritize repeated repair or triage and invest the big money in transition? Next. So as I kind of already said, I'm going to go quickly. The gas utility business model right now is, in my opinion, vulnerable. It's not just the risks that happened here in Massachusetts with the Merrimack Valley gas system collapse, which ended up collapsing Columbia Gas of Massachusetts. But there is a real risk of rising price of gas, as demonstrated by the GridWorks study in California. And how would that look in a heating climate like New York or Massachusetts, or in a state that just dug billions into the gas system? So if a death spiral is set up, landing escalating prices on the backs of the most vulnerable, we have multiple losses in multiple sectors. So as regional and state governance fails to act, some communities have begun stepping in to craft their own solutions. You've seen gas bans pop up here and there. And really the question is, what is the path forward? Renewable gas does not meet the need to the percentage necessary and does not eliminate entirely several of these risks. So we believe that there is a real opportunity here for gas utilities to direct their financial investment capacity, existing grants of location, customers, and more to drive forward the clean energy revolution, being part of the solution and really putting themselves and their customers in a better position for the future. Next. So by using gas utilities to build the geogrid, we add 3 key benefits to our list. I believe these 3 matter a lot. First, our existing regulated public utility model does allow access to low-cost energy for all, and this equity matters even more right now. And this is on the right, a Bureau-Happold approximation or prediction determining the customer's energy cost is lower than gas. It's probably an underestimate, but they were trying to be very careful. In addition, a utility-led transition can roll the varying and often large customer costs of building an HVAC transition. Potentially, one model could be to do this through a securitization and transition of assets that directs funds towards worker retraining and household transition for the low income, making it a really dramatically more equitable approach also to speed and scale. And that includes that utility scale financing, which can make this again to speed and scale with equity. The worker retraining aspect, this was just, there was legislation passed last year in Colorado from coal to wind that redirected some funds to worker retraining. I think that's also a great possibility because of course a just transition has to include the workers, their jobs, and this does. If you can fuse an HDPE pipe for gas, you can fuse an HDPE pipe for water. And so in summary, this is the fastest way forward. I know, if you have more ideas, I'm listening. It takes out the key opponents to the clean energy transition, leverages enormous financial and regulatory infrastructure, and even supports a faster electric grid transition. And so this alignment of interests, I believe, is part of why the idea is moving so fast. In Massachusetts, Eversource Gas filed a rate case last fall in 2019. We're towards the end of that rate case now. That was the first proposal for multiple geo-microdistrict pilots. This year, our Massachusetts Attorney General laid out a plan to make a plan for gas transition. I know you also have a similar situation in New York. Our Columbia Gas Territory sale settlement includes a pilot for that territory. We have, National Grid has stated they're moving forward with geothermal in a filing this fall. So currently the 3 largest utility territories in Mass will potentially pilot this idea. And there's a similar trend outside of Mass, particularly in New York, with both NGrid and Con Ed moving forward to consider such pilots. A recent Mohawk gas, I believe, filing is fascinating. In the middle of this pandemic, basically, with equity and economic concern rising, this plan is gaining momentum. And I kind of hopefully feel that perhaps we've all learned the risk of inaction and the benefit of coming together in crisis. Next. Oops, next, Audrey. Sorry. Yep, we skipped one. Keep going. Thank you. We're attempting to get out ahead of this, and we realized that comparing these different pilots and having a standardized data collection and evaluation between them is essential for us all to continue to learn as rapidly as possible from the process. So we have assembled a team of various experts to provide research and evaluation for these pilots in Mass, potentially and hopefully elsewhere, sharing transparently all of the data. And we really just want to ensure that it's done right, that there's a thorough design review by some of you as well. And we want to standardize the data collection and evaluation so they can be compared, building kind of an open access library, transparent and for the public good. And we are working out how to do that. And the next slide. Oh, you're already there, Audrey. So this is a really cool grayed out map. This is the last slide of our gas infrastructure here in Massachusetts. And actually, it's kind of beautiful in Massachusetts. I don't know about New York. Some of those pipes that are in the ground are actually from the time of Lincoln's presidency, which is totally amazing. And I've wondered increasingly if those with the vision to begin building that back in the 1800s imagined where we'd be now. And we have to ask today, all of us here today, what is our vision for the infrastructure we need and want for this coming century? And how do we get there? Can we plan a transition from a gas to geogrid to maximize climate impact and equity, health and safety, reliability, jobs, save money? What are the other options? What can we do? What if we categorize our existing gas distribution system into parts? The still essential for combustion, the thermal grid compatible for strategic evolution, and the remainder, which would require building by building electrification and strategic abandonment by the gas utility. However we do this, let's plan, because I think this is the moment, probably a once in many lifetimes opportunity to reimagine our energy future. As we emerge from this pandemic, wiser, I hope, let's build something beautiful and lasting. And this photo is from our MIT design shred earlier this year with gas utilities, geo experts, professors, activists, workers, and more. And while we need to do this virtually now, let's do this. Let's come together, all hands on deck. There's enough work and credit for every single person in the geo industry, the district energy industry, the HVAC, the gas. Together, we can build a better future fast. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zeyneb and Audrey. And we're a little behind time, so I'm just gonna pass it right off to Stuart to give us some examples of shared loop systems and ownership models. So go ahead, Stuart.
Yeah, sounds good. Thank you. Let me just pull up my presentation here. Okay, you able to see that?
Yeah.
Okay, sounds good. Okay, thanks for including me in this. I'll run through this very quickly, and hopefully we can kind of catch up on time a little bit. I'll give you a brief introduction about Orca and Geotility. Geotility is our infrastructure company. We've been designing and installing geothermal systems ranging from single-family residential up to large-scale campus systems for 30 plus years. Excuse me. Orca Energy is our utility company, which is a sister company to Geotility. And we've been owning and operating mainly residential geothermal systems for about 15 to 18 years now. I started out in Canada designing single-family systems and through TerraSource, which is our sister version of Orca. What we would do is, or what we do now is we design and install the system, and then we retain ownership of that system in perpetuity. So that would be just the exterior ground loop system. So just the pipe in the ground that connects to the home. Everything inside the home is kind of business as usual. We focus on new construction for the most part. We've done a lot of retrofits on the installation side, but within our utility umbrella, we really focus primarily on new construction. That's been and continues to be our focus. So, you know, as an initial point, when we're hearing what Cullen is offering, it's fantastic because it kind of dovetails into what we're doing, because he's talking about retrofits, mainly air source and potentially geo. And what Audrey and Zeyneb are talking about is, you know, gas companies owning infrastructure. It all complements each other. I think that's, you know, one of the main conclusions I'm going to draw today is that it's really going to take a whole series of different solutions to make a transition away from gas to electricity happen. It's going to take multiple technologies. It's going to take geothermal heat pumps. It's going to take air source heat pumps, district, non-district. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about just some experience we've had with district and with non-district experience. So as I mentioned, our focus is on new construction. And the reason for that is, from our perspective, it's kind of the low-hanging fruit. We do a lot of new construction through our geoutility company, and it's the area that we're focusing on currently. Although you know, retrofits will probably become multifamily retrofits will become more of our business will lead into that as well. But currently, it's on the new construction side. So as I mentioned, Orca owns the exterior ground loop for these systems. We own the pipe in the ground, and our demarcation point usually stops directly at the foundation or the building envelope. Everything within the building, whether it be a multifamily or a single family, is owned by either the homeowners association or the homeowner themselves. So one of the questions I was asked to address in this and other presentations is the feasibility of doing district energy systems. So I thought I'd address that primarily by just giving some examples of recent systems that we've been involved in. So the first example would be the city of Richmond. That's Richmond, British Columbia, just south of Vancouver. It's a suburb to Vancouver. The airport's located in Richmond. That's a municipally owned district energy system that has been in place now for close to 10 years, probably. They've been owning and operating that. There's some other district energy systems in British Columbia as well. The Vancouver Athletes Village is a fairly well-known system where they use waste heat off the sewer to heat the Athletes Village development, which was used to house the athletes during the 2010 Olympics. And now it's all been converted to market housing. We're currently working on a Microsoft project that's a large campus-wide zero carbon district energy system. And then I've got some other examples. All that to say that there are many examples of district energy systems that use geothermal, primarily geothermal, and usually it's combined with other types of technologies. A lot of these systems are, in some cases, are hybrids. So the city of Richmond, for example, they have natural gas boilers, they have cooling towers to help with peak loads, whereas Microsoft, they have actually electric boilers, which seems a little bit crazy, but they, as redundancy, they have electric boilers that will be operating to provide additional heat if required. Their mandate was to be completely zero carbon. So a lot of these systems have it's not just geothermal heat pumps that are tied into the system. There are other technologies. But overall, all that to say that there are many district energy systems, as many of you know, that are based around geothermal systems. Geothermal technology, I should say. So the next question is, who should own these renewable district energy systems? Well, I don't really answer that directly. I kind of skate around this one because I believe that there are various different types of ownership models that make sense. So Cullen's example as a third-party ownership, or Orca, our example, or it could be investor-owned utilities. We've been involved in projects that have ownership, that have very distinct ownership models. So I discussed Richmond, which is a municipally owned, so public, it's owned by the municipality directly. We've done a lot of work on investor-owned utilities that own these systems. A local example for us is Fortis Alternative Energy Services. They own systems, but they're a publicly traded company. And then other private corporations who may be installing these on their own campuses, or companies like ourselves. We're a private company that operates like a utility, although we're not a registered utility and we're not a regulated utility in most of the areas that we work in. So ownership model really can vary depending on region and project. So let's talk about the, there's been a lot of talk, Zeyneb and Audrey mentioned the concept of doing geo microgrids and district energy systems. And I'm a supporter of district energy systems for sure. We've done a lot of work with them, and I'm a big advocate for them. Although I do believe that the local project knowledge, or the actual physics behind the location next to other buildings, all these different factors, loads, heating, cooling loads, sharing of energy, all these factors come into effect when you're determining whether a system should be district or should be individual. So a lot of the developments that we've been doing have been residential only, or specifically residential occupancy. And there's a little bit, you can make the argument that if you have a street full of residential residential homes, that it makes more sense to just have individual systems from a capital cost perspective. Tying systems together into a district type of approach starts to make more sense when you have load sharing and you have a greater or more density in your occupancy. So, we're doing some developments now that are a mix of the two. We have a development in Denver that we're getting close to starting on. That's going to have the lower density development on the perimeter of the development. It's going to be individual ground loops, where we get into the kind of the community center, the central core, where you have more commercial. Those will be district systems that are tied in together. So again, it's project specific solutions as to whether a system should be district or it should be an individual ground loop. So some examples of some projects that we've worked on. A project in Kelowna, British Columbia, which is where I'm located. We have over 400 homes now that are on geothermal. It's a mixed community. It's not a geothermal only community. There are gas furnaces, there are air source heat pumps. There's a mix of different types of technologies like you'd see in most communities. But a good portion of the homes, at least I think that over 50% of the homes are geothermal. It's located right on bedrock, so from a geo drilling perspective, it's great. And each one of these homes is an individual ground loop. We bill each homeowner individual monthly loop access fees and treat them as their individual customers, individual ground loops. Other example is Maple Lawn. We did some work for Bozzuto in Baltimore. Same idea, it's individual ground loops. All of these systems are, for the most part, vertically drilled. We find with the capacity that we're trying to achieve through our systems, it's difficult to do that through horizontal systems. Some larger communities that have maybe more of a rural aspect will do non-vertically drilled systems, but for the most part, everything's vertically drilled. We also did a charter school in just southwest of Atlanta in Chattahoochee. Each school building, these are individual school buildings, they each have their own single water air heat pump. I believe they're 3 or 4 tons, 4-ton heat pumps in each unit. And again, they have their own ground loop serving each school classroom. Serenbe, you're probably familiar with Serenbe. We did a multifamily in Serenbe, which is they look like a brownstone kind of walk-up type of development. And again, individual systems. Here's a list of other projects. So to conclude, one of the questions is, again, and what are the keys to success in developing these types of renewable district energy systems, whether they be geo or not? I think all of these points apply to all technologies. The number one point is that project-specific solution. I think it's critical that we don't try to paint, and we see it, everybody wants a kind of made in, wherever you are solution. And the reality is each building has its own challenges, has its own, whether it's unique mechanical systems or geographic location or geology, which affects geothermal systems. Each project has to be looked at on an individual basis. The timing of build out is really critical as well. If you're putting infrastructure in the ground and spending money on pipes in the ground, you want to make sure that that asset is being used as quickly as possible. So that becomes a major factor. And then from a technical standpoint, you want to match technology. You want to make sure the designs are all done to the latest, the latest standards, and make sure it's done by experienced engineers and specialists. And finally, ownership models will vary. I believe the future is going to be a mix of ownership models. There's going to be some private ownership. There's going to be public. They might be regulated. We work in our region here. Thermal energy in British Columbia is regulated. So if you're selling thermal energy, you need to go to the BC Utilities Commission, which is the regulating body. So I think multiple models are gonna start popping up. There are different third-party ownership models like ours that are out there, and I think it's going to be kind of a tapestry of different types of approaches. There you go.
Thanks, Stuart. And I will pass it off to Owen Brady, Future of Heat Manager at National Grid, to tell us a bit about how National Grid is orienting towards heat pumps. Oh, you're muted, Owen. I don't know if you...
Sorry about that. Can you see my PowerPoints, or do I need to? Yes?
We see them. Yep.
Okay. So I'm going to try to go very quickly because a lot of what I was going to say has been covered, which is wonderful. It means we're all thinking about this in a similar way, but also because I know there are a couple of topics that I'm going to present on that people might be particularly interested in. This slide just gives a little bit of a background in terms of how did we as sort of a gas utility become interested in geothermal. Some of those points have already been made, but basically it is looking at, we all want to achieve similar things, which is improving efficiency and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And we are trying to think about what options we can create to make that happen as quickly as possible. One thing that I found as I was preparing for this that I thought was interesting was this chart from the EIA that shows how the Northeast is really unique. If you look at sort of the drop off in terms of fuel oil and kerosene consumption, it's significant, which is an exciting thing. But you can see that that drop off is offset by sort of increased natural gas use and increased electricity use, whereas in almost every other region of the country, natural gas use is trending down as well, and electricity is really taking over on that. Partially that is due to electric rates within the Northeast, also partially due to cultural momentum, which has been discussed before in terms of what people are familiar with, what builders tend to choose when they're creating new properties, and how the codes play into all of that as well. But I thought this was a useful characterization. Geothermal opportunity, we've discussed all of this before. There are single site systems, there are shared loop or district heating systems, and of course it's really an intrinsic opportunity for energy exchange if you have the shared loop system, which is what we find particularly interesting. We did a demo in Long Island in Riverhead, New York. This was proposed in our 2016 rate case, 10 homes connected to a 30-ton shared loop. Similar to some of the projects that Stuart was just talking about with Orca, this is a single property owner. So this is one big 55+ community. And so therefore it simplified some of the installation questions. You can see that there are the wells in the green space between all of the homes, and there are 10 homes that are connected to that. Customers have been enjoying the service and experienced benefits beyond simply having renewable heating and cooling, but no smell from the kerosene, improved indoor air quality. Operation as quiet as a whisper, as I saw on Cullen's slide, which I liked. So that was definitely a good finding. And these systems have performed very well in both extremely cold winters that we had in early 2018, as well as warm summers. So this has given us, again, encouragement to think that there's some opportunity to explore geothermal as a potential way for us to provide service to our customers. One thing I will say is under the existing utility structures, we have a legal obligation to provide service to a customer that requests natural gas service, assuming that we are able to do so and within all of the constraints of our service tariffs. That being said, it may be that if there was an alternative available, such as a utility-owned geothermal system, that we might be required to provide some sort of service to a customer, and it potentially could be one or both. One or the other, not necessarily simply a natural gas service. So that's something that we've been thinking about is what do we do in the future if customers continue to request natural gas service, and how do we manage that in terms of the overall energy portfolio for the region. Scaling, as I say here at the bottom, I think really scaling this technology like Audrey and Zeyneb were discussing is going to require complex installations. That's going to mean potentially some district systems. That's going to mean complex geography, geology. It's going to mean working with different types of customers, LMI, CNI, all sorts of different things. And so it's going to be important that there are good standards for these systems and that there's coordination in terms of how they are installed and run. So the thing that I'll just spend some time on here, I thought Stuart's projects were fantastic. I really actually want to follow up and learn more about all of them. but I do think there is probably going to be a mix of ownership models, and we as the utility are saying maybe there's something we can do to help in that. It doesn't mean that we should be the service provider, the sort of the first choice of service provider, but there might be something that we can do, especially when it comes to coordinating and connecting multiple independent economic entities. As Bob has been saying in the comments, us serving single family homes is probably not the right thing from a utility perspective. So we want to make sure that we are doing things that feel appropriate based on our market role. The proposal that we put in the case, which was filed on July 31st, is installing 2,600 tons of capacity over 3 years. That's approximately 654-ton single-family home systems, or it could be divided over larger systems as well. It's approximately 86 Riverhead projects, so definitely a very sizable increase, and exclusively focusing on shared loop projects and really how we can develop best practices for installing those types of systems. You can see in the second bullet, installations will occur in partnership with the competitive suppliers of geothermal heat pumps, with the company owning the shared loop infrastructure and supplying thermal energy to connected customers under a long-term contract rate. The idea here is that we are not the experts in this space. There are experts in the space. We want to work closely with them and ensure that we are working together to accelerate this technology. Last bullet is talking a little bit about the financing here. And effectively what we did is we took the existing asset depreciation model that we use for gas infrastructure, and we are going to apply the exact same thing to geothermal infrastructure, with the idea that we are simply mortgaging the shared loop asset over its useful life. That provides a longer financing time horizon than many alternatives, and it's something that allows us to take on sort of the burden of the asset at the beginning as we're connecting multiple customers, and then there would be a fixed regulated charge that each customer would pay based upon their connected capacity. So this is one potential ownership model. It may be that there are others that will flourish in the coming years, and so ours might not prove to be as necessary within the market, but we think that this might be a way that it could allow for some of that equity that we've been discussing as customers have sort of a clear pricing that they would be able to pay. The last thing I'll note is currently we do not have any subsidy from gas customers other than a share of general overhead expenses. And the reason for that is because as we're figuring out whether utility ownership is appropriate, we want to make sure that we are not conflating the two rate bases or asking gas customers necessarily to pay for geothermal service. It's possible that in the future policy might change and there would be a desire for gas customers to subsidize this so that it could potentially accelerate. But at this time, what we have proposed is simply the geothermal customers will pay for the entire cost of the geothermal assets. So with that, I will turn it over to Michaela and Betta for the questions.
Thanks, Owen. Thanks, everybody. That was fantastic. I think all of our minds are blown by the possibilities, and especially Owen. I know you're going to have to jump in a minute, but we appreciate you being on. Some of our Renewable Heat Now members have been, engaged in rate cases and pipeline fights with National Grid. So it's wonderful to see that you all are thinking about the future of heat and how we can shift to investing in renewable technology. So really great to hear what's happening on that front. And I will just really quickly give a plug for Renewable Heat Now, so we can continue to build this movement for renewable heat in New York State, and you can stay in the loop with shared loops, with ground loops, and making air source heat pumps the norm for New York and beyond. So I'm going to put in the chat a link to join Renewable Heat Now so we can all stay connected moving forward and keep building this movement. And I'll pass it off to Michaela to ask the first question.
Great, thanks, Betta. So yes, Owen, we know that you might need to hop off, as well as maybe one of the heat reps. So we'll be able to take questions for about 10 minutes with people that are able to stay, but this question's for Owen. What are your thoughts? Would you consider suggesting that shareholders to bear the burden of the cost of transitioning the system? The shareholder model of utility has made exorbitant profit from ratepayers for years. This can be a way to make transition more just to geothermal.
So I think the cost sharing of any transition is one of the most complicated and important questions to be asking, right? It is no longer a question of if this transition needs to happen. It does. It needs to happen as quickly as possible, and there will be costs that go along with the transition. And one of the things that we are hoping that our proposal might do is to create a regulated investment pathway for geothermal systems. The idea being that the regulators are there to ensure that any of the costs and any of the profit that is being earned from these projects is reviewed and is approved by the regulatory body. It's certainly possible that there could be additional, corporate input into that, and certainly it's possible that the shareholders, I mean, we're seeing a lot of shareholders vote with their dollars by divesting from companies that are not making enough progress towards the energy transition. And so it's entirely possible that you could imagine that support extending to wanting the effectively the dividend to be shifted over to retained earnings and invested into projects that supported the transition. I don't have a clear position on exactly what approach we will take in the future, assuming we are granted the right to play in this space, but it's something that we will be continuing to discuss, and certainly that we would want to engage with all stakeholders on.
Awesome. And just can I ask one more before you have to hop off?
Yes.
Okay. What about transitioning existing gas customers to district geothermal?
Absolutely. It's a great question. And I've been typing answers to a couple of them in here to try to get a few more. So hopefully I got as many as possible, and please feel free to reach out to me if you have more. Existing gas customers transitioning to geo, again, with our obligation to serve for customers that want natural gas, we don't know that we have the right, and generally we've heard that we don't have the right to remove a gas service for a customer that has service or that wants service. So if we were to identify customers that said, hey, I'm interested in transitioning to geo, that's where there might be an opportunity to do that. Certainly as we look at the situation in areas where there are supply constraints for gas, there's an opportunity to say, if this customer who currently is using X quantity of gas is no longer using it, right, that helps to manage the overall need for gas on a peak day and throughout the year. So we see that as an exciting opportunity, but it becomes a question of customer appetite. And if we start doing district systems, it becomes a question of, can we coordinate all of those customers efficiently and ensure that the costs that they are bearing are appropriate, and that the choice they are making does not affect the broader parts of the system. And Audrey and Zeyneb have been great about this, effectively saying, let's look at the fringes of the tree, so to speak, where we can find isolated parts of the system that could be converted, or potentially parts of the system where there are multiple feeders, and one of them could simply be sort of isolated and removed. A geothermal system could be replaced here, and that way the overall system would not be impacted unless a decision was made to do that.
Great. So I have another question that might be for any of the speakers to chime in about. If we compare the process of installing heat pump systems in large buildings compared to the process of fracked gas systems side by side, where do you find the barriers for air source heat pump that gas does not have? How can activists help break up these barriers? We just need to have a list of them. So barriers for air source heat pump adoption that gas doesn't have. Anyone from HEET or BlocPower?
Can you restate the question?
If we compare the process of installing heat pump systems in large buildings compared to the process of fracked gas systems side by side, what are the barriers for air source heat pumps that gas does not have? Yeah, and that was for BlocPower.
Sure. So I'm assuming we're just talking about regular natural gas heating systems, right? It's using fracked gas, of course, which is where a lot of gas comes from, which is not good. But one of the barriers often is people had gas already, right? So installing that is easy, right? You just swap out what you had with what you're going to have, right? So if you want to put a heat pump in, you might need to not use radiators anymore if you had radiators. But another barrier, I think, on the more environmental side, another barrier on the environmental side would be that would be coming from the other side is the fracked gas is increasingly harder and harder to come by, and that means that gas prices are likely to increase in the future. So it's hard to say, yeah, sure, gas prices are going to be higher, but when you look at the long-term savings from a heat pump that you're installing versus a gas system that you're installing, you can probably look at higher savings even than you might see historically.
And a follow-up question to that, Cullen, how do the lease costs compare to what the replacement costs would be for a fossil fuel unit?
Sure. So we actually, when we do our quotes, we think about this, right? We think about what's the energy savings, what's the O&M savings, because a lot of folks we speak with are using old, creaky boilers, things that haven't been maintained and are past their useful life. And so energy savings, operations and maintenance savings, and then replacement cost savings. So right now, I mean, we see costs anywhere from 25 to 75% more for the raw installation cost, right? So what you're talking about with that in terms of a lease, though, there's no one that offers a zero money down, 15-year natural gas lease, right? So the capital cost is higher, but the incentives are also there for the heat pumps, and the fact that you can pay for this over 15 years and have the savings cover your payments is sort of how we think of this as a difference.
Okay, thank you. This one is directed towards HEET, about how you got the Massachusetts Attorney General involved. In New York, do you see a similar path? Could we potentially go to Tish James and say, help, we want to make this happen. We want to make this a reality. Can you just talk a little bit about your strategy there with the Attorney General in Mass?
Well, our strategy as HEET has simply been to remain in communication and build relationships with the Attorney General's office, and to consult them on any number of things. I don't know the politics in New York, but our Attorney General was already involved in questions around gas infrastructure before HEET even began working on gas. So their interest was there as well, and there's been a mutual conversation and data sharing going on for years. So we're deeply appreciative of her careful and thoughtful action. But there are a lot of other groups also meeting, talking. There's a growing conversation between a lot of agencies as well. So I certainly wouldn't claim that we had a singular strategy.
Well, it's very exciting what you're doing, and I think there's a lot of interest from advocates on the ground in New York to be able to move forward in a similar fashion. Mick, do you want to ask the next question?
Or I was looking one for Stuart, and maybe this is one that you already answered. But the Canadian government is very keen on their hydroelectricity. Is there also Canadian support for what you do?
Yeah. So I'll answer. I typed in an answer for that, but so it's interesting because we're grouped in provinces, not as opposed to states like you are, but our current province, the province I'm in BC, we get zero support for geothermal heat pumps from both the provincial and the federal governments. We don't have a 30% tax credit like, or the 24, 26% like you have in the US at the federal level. So we've been kind of struggling. Well, we've been working in this industry with little to no support for pretty much for as long as I can remember. There have been the odd incentives and whatnot, but the market, I would say the market, especially in New York State right now, has to be the best in all of North America with the amount of financial support for personal incentives and what NYSERDA has done and what the utilities have taken over now. It's, you're in a market that should that is really well set to expand heat pump adoption. I haven't experienced that. We've been having to have it stand on its, we like to say, if we can make it work without any incentives, it sure as heck better be able to work when there's tons of incentives in place. So, you know, you're in a marketplace now that is primed for mass expansion.
Absolutely. And as I said in the beginning, when we launched Renewable Heat Now, there were no rebates for heat pumps. And now we have over 450 million for heat pumps alone. And then with energy efficiency, literally $3 billion. So it's very exciting that we're investing in New York in energy efficiency, in heat pumps, in electrifying our buildings. And we just need to do it as quickly as possible. So yeah,
that's great. And it's interesting because the industry needs the help, because look at the other industries. Natural gas industry, I think it's pretty clear that they've had enough support over the years and by all different levels. So you know, it's only fair that, like solar, for example, look at the growth that solar experienced with the massive tax credits through the last 20 years, and we see the growth there. So yeah, no, it's good timing right now.
Definitely. And similarly with the financing, as I think Cullen was pointing out, with the lease structure, which actually we do have a question about that, which is what happens after a 15-year lease? Is there a new lease or?
Sure.
Yeah.
So we have 15 years targeted for the useful life of the equipment, right? Which is really 20 years. 15 is like a very certain period that it will last for. And so what happens at the end is there's three options, right? You can either buy the system out, and that's just generally 15% of the upfront cost. You can continue a contract with a new lease, in which case we'll likely swap out any of the systems that are sort of at the end of life and continue to run them and continue to offer the performance guarantee and the maintenance and all that. So essentially you just have the same system and the same guarantees, that just gets refreshed. And then the third option is if you don't want it, we'll take them away at no cost. So, you know, we'll leave the distribution infrastructure. If you want to get your own separate ones, you can still have all the holes and piping for refrigerant lines and anything else like that, but we'll take the units. And so that's us.
And those monthly payments were for both commercial buildings, single family, multifamily? How does that work?
So because of the way that our financing is set up, we don't work with what we'd call consumer credit, right? So we're not working with single family homeowners. We'll work with really any other building, right? So this could be commercial buildings, multifamily buildings, office buildings, churches. We do a lot of house of worship work. We do a lot of work with nonprofits, affordable housing, as I mentioned. There's other folks out there that do the single family. We may do the single family at some point, but you know, our company focus has been on these small and medium-sized buildings. So, and yeah, it's for any of them.
And
Thanks.
we don't want to keep the speakers for too much longer, but we will answer a few more of the questions. And I think, Zeyneb, you already answered this in the Q&A, but if you want to expand on it. If a home is if it already has an air source heat pump system installed, how can they tie into a geomicro district?
Yeah, no, not that we have this figured out. We don't. However, I really hope that what we can do is see any thermal source and sink as a potential node on a thermal energy network. And so a building with an air source heat pump, there are going to be times on a ground source heat pump connected thermal grid where that would be a more optimal, given the temperature ranges, a more optimal thing to run. And so if there was an opportunity to optimize, including that air source heat pump, including whatever infrastructure a building joining on has, so even a building with a ground source array, like a borehole array with a ground source heat pump, could still join a thermal grid and simply be both a provider of thermal energy and a buyer. And the shared energy would be the gain for both sides. I don't know if I answered that very clearly, but.
No, I think that makes sense.
I think there's a couple groups developing hybrid systems that use ground source or air source depending on the situation.
Interesting. A point as well too is, as time goes on, we're working with air source heat pumps, especially maybe in the context of what Stuart's doing. We're familiar working on the property owner side. If there's ground source units that are required, those are things that could get rolled into the type of work that we do too, so that the whole solution can be provided in that case.
So I know we all could stay on talking about this and learning more for 5 more hours, but we can't do that to our speakers. Thank you so much. We'll ask one more question, which I think, we can only, again, touch on, and we'll have to talk about this much more in the future. But that is a question about, are we in a place in New York with incentives where moratoriums can be considered? Moratoriums meaning like no new gas, I'm assuming. Moratoriums can be considered in low-income communities without pushing vulnerable populations into expensive electric heat. Many already are, though. Have you seen any municipalities leading a just transition well in this space? So that's something that we all want to see, an affordable, just transition from fossil fuels to renewable technologies. I don't know if Zeyneb, you want to touch on this. Maybe we can hear from all of our speakers what your thinking is on this very important topic, knowing that we're going to have to continue the conversation in the future.
It's a very important topic. It's also challenging. I don't know the exact numbers for New York. I know that in Massachusetts, for a lot of our older buildings, the transition to an air source heat pump does raise the costs particularly for vulnerable or low income family. And so that is a real barrier that we have to consider. There was a gas ban movement in Massachusetts, which has currently halted for regulatory, legal reasons. But in the process of that movement, it shifted to including low-income households and representatives as well as workers in the discussion, which made it more complex. But the conclusion was really that state level action was the appropriate path, and that there would need to be efforts to provide lower cost heat or subsidies for low income households. I don't think the problem's solved yet. I mean, part of our Geomicrodistrict proposal is to attempt to solve that problem in a heating climate. It's a real tension between the short-term increased costs and the long-term huge cost burdens. So which risks do you weight and how?
This is a question we think about a lot as well in our context, right? Working with affordable housing and the fact that heating costs are often borne by the landlord. The landlords in many buildings will want to say, well, I don't want to bear these heating costs anymore. So that becomes a challenge. But for affordable housing specifically, the landlords do, and that's a good thing. And what we do see in what we look at is when tenants start to have control over their own systems and do have to have some coverage of paying for it, efficiency does go up, right? So that if you go from a situation where the landlord is paying for all the utilities in a building to a situation where the tenants are paying for all the utilities in the building, you should be using less energy. The question then becomes, how do you correctly match that up, right? Because if you just put the cost to the tenant, now the tenant is paying more than they did before. Whereas if all the tenants, though, like is common in New York City, open their windows in the winter, the whole building is going to pay a lot more money for heating. And then all of those costs are going to get passed along to everybody else. So it's sort of, I think, as you're saying, Zeynep, it's a problem that's being solved, but from our standpoint, there's a lot of ways that sort of the efficiency of the system, if we can capture all of that and get rid of the split incentive there, the efficiency of the system should be able to help reduce the costs to people in that. So it's
I agree. I think from our perspective, whenever we're developing rates for a new project, whether it be multi, single, or any type of sector, we're always cognizant that we have to be competitive with current rates. And that would be, you know, the current natural gas rates or current electricity or whatever the current situation is. So we have to present rates. And that was interesting to see Owen present the dollar per month per ton rate when they took the geothermal side and put it into their natural gas model. It came out very similar to the within, you know, same order of magnitude of the rates that we charge our customers for per ton or per 4-ton system. So we're always thinking about how do we have to, if we don't present rates that are competitive with the current other technologies, then they're not going to use our system. They're going to just opt with the business as usual case. So I don't know how to answer your moratorium question. I think that's a tough one. How does that play into it? But I mean, I think market's a big factor for us. We're working in a market where it's a public market where we have to be competitive or else our systems don't go in. If we can't develop a business model that makes sense, then they won't be going with our technology. I think the big factor in the change recently is recent incentives and grants and fund tax credits and those sort of things that are, my personal opinion is that it's just kind of bringing us on a more level playing field with natural gas when you look at the cost of natural gas. So, but ultimately it has to be competitive. It has to be accepted by the market, whether it be the nonprofit market or for-profit market. And it, you know, that's what kind of drives all of our customers' decisions in the end anyways.
Indeed. Okay, well, we're going to have to leave it there, but thank you all so much for your time. Thanks everybody for being here and being a part of this, and we'll keep building the movement for renewable heat now. So have a great day, everyone.
Thank you, Michaela.
Thank you.
And great to talk with all of you.